Hello, good afternoon, good morning, depending where you're at. I'm Serge Schmemann. I'm with the editorial board of the New York Times. With me is David Sanger, who's the Washington correspondent. For the Times, both of us are veterans of the newspaper. We've seen many elections, we've covered many. We're here to discuss covering the United States election this year. And my first thought this morning was that maybe this panel is superfluous. We could just play last night's debate between President Trump and Vice President Joe Biden, and I think you would all see very clearly what we're up against covering this election. It was quite an amazing show, filled with fireworks, and today's newspapers, I presume around the world, are filled with analyses. And I know, David, that you've been up since before dawn writing your own analysis. So maybe you can share your first thoughts. What did you see? What did you not see? What surprised you?
Well, Serge, great to be with you and great to be back with the Athens Democracy Forum. And I'm only sorry that we can't all be doing this in Athens as we had first planned. In part because it might be refreshing right now to be at the seat of democracy. There were a number of remarkable things I thought in last night's debate. First was just the tumble of the show. We're used to these following a certain pattern and a certain degree of respect and decorum, and people throwing in the odd zinger line that you remember later on, that there he goes again from Reagan, or Ford's gaffe about whether Poland was under Soviet control. All these things seem pretty tame compared to what we saw last night, which was more brawl than debate, more heat than discussion, constant interruption by the president, the challenger to the president, a former vice president himself, referring to the president as a clown and telling him to shut up. This is not the usual stuff, and I was trying to imagine for a moment that I was a foreigner tuning into this and trying to understand if this was usual for an American democracy. It certainly isn't, but there's been nothing usual about the past 4 years. The most interesting part to my mind came in the very last few minutes of the debate, when the president was asked once again whether or not he would respect the outcome of the election, something we really haven't questioned very much since George Washington first ran in December of 1788. And since that time, we've run elections through civil wars, through natural disasters, having troops spread across the world. And there's really never been a case that I can recall from history in which a president has basically signaled from the beginning that he wouldn't accept any outcome except one in which he wins. In other words, that our election had to look more like the one we just saw in Belarus. But it got even stranger than that, because in the course of his answers on the election, he made it clear that he believed that there was no way to run a fair election with mail-in ballots, described widespread fraud. Well, 5 states, 10% of our states, have run universal mail-in ballot elections for years now, and we've had very little fraud. He suggested that he wanted to send poll watchers to the polls to make sure and watch very carefully what was happening. Seemed to be a signal for intimidation of those who actually show up at the polling places. And finally, my biggest concern was that his warnings about fraud in the election would actually become a signal to the Russians, among others, who have been amplifying his message in their own disinformation about what the mail-in ballots could do in the way of throwing the election into chaos. And as we head into these last 34 days between now and election day, the biggest fear you have is that the president himself may be signaling to Putin that anything he does to create some kind of disruption on election day would only prove the point that the president's been making, that this has to go ultimately to the Supreme Court or to the Congress, where the president believes that he's got an edge.
I agree with you. It was quite an amazing spectacle and in many ways quite frightening. Um, and on the day after, there's both a hell of a lot to say and it's being said, and at the same time, almost nothing to add. We saw President Trump for what he is. We saw Joe Biden for what he is. I mean, the choice is stark. But as I watched, I was also pondering the theme of our debate, of our conversation, the problem of covering this election, of covering Trump. He showed himself to be the man who absolutely cannot allow the narrative to get out from under his control, who lies systematically, who has all these exaggerations, who attacks the press again and again, who's prepared to go to the mud. And this has created, again, the problem we've faced for the last 3, 4 years, I think, of how to cover the man. How do you cover somebody who considers you an enemy, who has had more than 2,000 tweets attacking the news, who always calls our paper the failing New York Times, fake news, and all these other things he said, who's actually suggested that we're traitors. How do you cover this? And I think it poses a problem in the social media age when the whole level of debate has become, to a degree, more direct, less polite. A lot more exaggeration is acceptable. And we are under pressure, those of us like you and me who are a bit older, who are veterans of a different kind of press, we're under pressure to go after Trump, to act as the enemy that he wants us to be, instead of just trying to cover this with fairness and decency. How do you cover something like this, a display like this that is just so riddled with exaggeration, lies, something that, as you described, it is so below the level of decency that's normal in politics, except by, again, taking sides after him. It's posed, I think, a huge challenge for us. And I wanted to ask you as well, we've talked before this, and you suggested at the same time that it's not that Trump may not be really the cause of everything that's happening, that perhaps we've put too great a faith in this election to get us out of this hell that some of us feel we've been living through, that if Biden gets elected, things will all get better. How do you answer that? Do you think that perhaps we have been a bit blinded by Trump to presume that there is a nice, decent world that we can return to?
Well, two great questions wrapped in there, Serge. Let me sort of unpack them one at a time. So let me start with the question of how you cover somebody like Donald Trump. And then let's turn to the question of whether, if Joe Biden gets reelected, the world goes back to something more akin to what we understand. In other words, could you reset the clock to January 20th, 2017, when Trump was inaugurated? To which I believe the answer is no, you can't. So on the first question, I've been at the Times now for 38 years. That's probably, just a freshman compared to you, Serge, doing this. But my overall sense is that for my colleagues, and I've certainly found, this is one of the biggest journalistic challenges I've ever faced. I think I came to recognize that when Maggie Haberman and I first went to go do foreign policy interviews with then candidate Donald Trump. And he went into them with no preparation, sort of as he did last night, and started spouting about letting Japan and South Korea and others get nuclear weapons because we don't want to spend the money to go defend them, and began doing all of the America First stuff that you've come to hear over time. The challenge has only gotten bigger as he has declared not only that the press is out to get him and distorts and so forth and so on. We've had lots of presidents maintain that. Abraham Lincoln didn't like the coverage he got terribly much, and he didn't like the coverage he got in the New York Times in specific. But he never went out and called the Times or other members of the press enemies of the people. And that, of course, is the line that the president is using the most. And that's what worries me the most, because what he's trying to do is not simply discredit the media, but basically take the media out as an obstacle to his view of the world, as he takes out all other groups that are supposed to be independent evaluators and truth tellers, right? Some days we may get at that truth, some days we may not. But the hostility you see for the press is the same hostility you see for Dr. Fauci and his colleagues who step out and say, no, the coronavirus isn't over. No, you haven't turned the corner. No, we're not going to be able to widely put a vaccine into people's arms until the middle of next year at the earliest. So he doesn't like anything that can build up a competing narrative. And if he doesn't like that, he goes out preemptively to tear down the group that would provide that narrative. And yes, he comes out and charges us with treason. He did so specifically to me and a colleague of mine when we wrote a story about the U.S. cyber interventions into the Russian electric grid. Then he turned around and said the story was wrong. I'm not sure which I'm supposed to believe, that we were treasonous or we were wrong, but it didn't make any difference because he was just throwing that out into the air. Now that takes you to the question of, will things go back the way many of our European friends believe and hope they will if Joe Biden gets elected? And I don't think you can ever really go home again in the world of international affairs, because in those 4 years, a few things have happened. First of all, we have to remember that Donald Trump isn't simply Donald Trump. He is a product of a divided nation. Those divisions will remain, and those people who support President Trump will go after his successor, led by Trump himself. If Donald Trump loses, and if he actually leaves office, he'll still have a Twitter account. And my guess is he will use it to rally the forces that he believes are behind him. The second is, the world isn't the way it was in 2017. China's made big, major incursions into not only the rest of Asia, but using its 5G networks and using the spread of apps like TikTok. It's become a much broader kind of competitor. Russia's been emboldened. You see that not only in their military activity around Europe, but you see it in what's happened in Belarus. You see it in the continuing Ukraine conflict. You see it certainly in Syria. Turkey, a NATO member, has become significantly emboldened. So, assuming that Biden becomes president, he would inherit a much more complex world. One in which I suspect you're going to see the U.S. take a much harder line toward Russia. One in which I think you will not see an end to the conflicts with China. So to those who think, if Trump is simply gone, we'll go back to the way things were, I don't think the world works that way.
Yeah, I fully agree with you there. The world has changed tremendously, and not because of Trump, and it will remain profoundly changed. In America is in a great malaise. It's very sharply divided. Again, to a degree, he played on those divisions, but they will remain. They were there before. We saw it already under the George W. Bush administration, and the hopes that all the Europeans had that Obama will resolve all the issues that existed under W. All this is so, but I think there's also a danger to treating Trump as simply a symptom of this new world, of this new politics, of all these divisions, because I think he is at the same time, in my view, genuinely dangerous. And I think a lot of that came out in the debate, the way he refused to condemn white supremacists, the way he played to racism and all his talk about suburbs, the way he routinely demonizes the press and tries to create the illusion that there are several competing realities, all of which are equal, the way he tries to use the military and diplomacy for personal gain, the way he did it in Ukraine, his bizarre relationship with Putin that none of us have ever gotten to the bottom of, and I hope someday we will. That he has, and of course, in the way he is now threatening not to accept the judgment of the election, the way he constantly um, suggests that write-in ballots are going to be false and that it's all going to be fixed. So I think apart from the fact that he is not the sole cause and that his departure will not fix all the things wrong in the world, but he has been, in my view, something of a danger. And I see that there was a question came up, and maybe you've been looking at this. Maybe you can talk to that a bit. Is a danger that he will try to remain in power, that he will just dismiss the election, or that he will accept only whatever comes out on election night? Let's say the election night shows him ahead, and then he will say that's it and will declare that the election. Do you think that we do face a danger, a constitutional danger, a month from now?
Oh, I certainly do. I mean, I think the time from November 3rd, the evening of November 3rd, to noon on January 20th, 2021, may be some of the most tumultuous and potentially most dangerous periods in the American democratic experiment. The president was asked outright during in the debate yesterday by Chris Wallace, the moderator, or the man who attempted to moderate, I guess I should say. It was not an easy task he was being given. Whether or not both candidates would pledge not to declare a victory on election eve, or election night, I should say, because it's clear a lot of the votes are going to be coming in later. And the president would not sign up to that. And if I was Joe Biden, I wouldn't sign up to it either, because he would be under pressure to go concede if the president, declared he was in victory, which I think Biden has no intention of doing. Now, why is this the case? If you've got a situation in which some group of people have come to the polls, physically to the polls, and the guesswork right now is that more of President Trump's supporters will go vote in person, in part because they believe less in the coronavirus danger, and in part perhaps because they don't believe that their votes will be properly counted in mail-in ballots, so they'll exercise their right to show up at the polls, and that's perfectly fine. You could see that the first results that come together, which come from those in-person votes, go up on the screen, and it may look like the president has a significant lead in Pennsylvania or in Wisconsin or Minnesota. I'm making these up as examples because they're battleground states and important ones. Nevada, another one, Florida, of course. And the president will want to seize on that to declare that he has been properly elected, when in fact, what it may simply be is that they have not counted the mail-in votes, which may be overwhelmingly for Biden, because his voters are more likely to go use the mail-in option or a drop-off box or some other way that doesn't require them to be at the polling place. That doesn't mean that those votes are less valid. It just means they haven't been counted yet. And every state has different rules about how this works. Part of the beauty of our federal system is no one's operating under the same rules. And some states can start counting the mail-in ballots as they arrive, some the day before Election Day, some the morning of Election Day, and some can't begin counting until the polls are closed. So
Yeah.
we're going to have very disparate results along the way on different timelines. And I think the president is going to play this to his advantage. If he sees he is losing, I suspect that all he will say is not necessarily that he won, but that the election was so fraudulent that it has to go to the Supreme Court or to Congress, both places where he thinks he has an edge. And he's talked about this some. The constitutional requirement for Congress is that every state delegation in the House gets one vote. So Vermont, where I'm sitting right now with a population of a little over 600,000, would have the same vote in the House for President of the United States as would California or New York or Texas. And right now, there are 26 congressional delegations that are dominated by the Republicans, meaning that the president would win by one vote. So he's already thinking out ahead to what his strategy is if he can simply create enough confusion about what's happened to try to throw the vote to something other than the Electoral College.
And what strikes me listening to him last night and long before that, when he talks about the weakness of the postal ballots and whatnot, is that he portrays himself in this and so much more as the victim, as somebody who's been victimized by a system that's against him, some kind of deep state. You sort of really want to ask him, but you're the president. It should be your responsibility to ensure that the postal system is functioning properly on election day, that they have the resources to hire additional staff and additional trucks and whatever else is needed. And yet he always makes it sound like there's some kind of state out there that some kind of institutions that want to bury him on
Came up
election
again in
day.
the forest management yesterday, where he declared that no one was taking care of the forest. Well, most of the
Yeah,
forests that have been burning have been federal lands.
it's federal lands. It was one of probably the most bizarre answers to climate change. That the answer to climate change is to get better forest management, that somebody out there should have better forest
Yeah.
management. It was one of those moments that you sort of wanted to go
Say
back and
what?
go to bed. Well, I'd like to get back a little bit to the media, to what you and I do. Uh, there's been, of course, a lot of pressure from younger reporters, from younger journalists, for us to take a more active role in combating what we see as Trump or conservative wave or whatever is perceived as the enemy. There's been some very sharp criticism. I've heard it. I'm sure you have too at dinners. Why aren't you guys pointing out how evil he is? Why aren't you guys doing this? Why aren't you guys doing that? And I'm wondering if how you take this. For me, maybe because of my age and experience, it's always my answer is always we have to stick to what the American press has been, to the ethics and traditions that we were brought up under, which include a certain set of ethics, a certain dedication to fairness, to decency, to accuracy, that we should not be seen to be actually campaigning, actively campaigning. Now, in this current administration, it's been very hard. It's very hard. And I'm on the opinion side, and we do take sides very openly, but it's been very hard to remain in any sense fair or balanced. And the pressure from younger journalists and from our readers has compounded that. What is your sense? Has there been a change in the way we practice journalism, and has Trump contributed to this with his animosity to us?
Well, Serge, I think we have to start by admitting that you and I are two news dinosaurs brought to this panel, and probably you would get a different view if you had a member of a much younger generation, serving on this panel who's got a different view. And as you said, you're in opinion now, but I'm old enough to remember when you were actually a news reporter, and these issues came up. I'm with you. I think that we don't want to let the world go back to where it was in the early days of the Republic, when you had newspapers that were linked to Jefferson or to the anti-Jeffersonian forces. But the fact of the matter is that if you look at the media writ large, that's exactly what has happened. The Fox News experiment more than 20 years ago to use the advent of cable television to pick out a slice of America that believed that the liberal elites of the media were not reporting the truth about those they believe in, forever change things. And so we have Fox on the right, and people go to that to reinforce their opinions. And you have MSNBC on the left, which was designed to be sort of the anti-Fox. And all of these have served, of course, to further this divide. And even within the newsroom of the New York Times, you see very different opinions. You saw this within your own opinion section when there was an uproar over the publication of a op-ed by Tom Cotton, one of the president's most partisan supporters in the Senate, a man who some people think could be headed in a second Trump term to be Secretary of Defense. And that the mere publication of his op-ed, which advocated using the military on the streets of America to put down protests, made them feel unsafe and that it shouldn't be in the newspaper. Now, you and I grew up in a different world in which you even let the most objectionable ideas appear on the op-ed page as a warning to the rest of the world. Hey, here's what these folks are actually thinking. But there has been a generational shift. I think it is possible, but not easy, to go write stories that lay out the president's untruths, that describe his motives and what it is that he is going about trying to do, particularly in this election. I'm trying to write this right now about last night's debate, and still stay within the norms that we've discussed. But I can tell you that a pro-Trump person who reads the pages of the New York Times believes that every story is selected to embarrass the president. So the division that we've seen in the country has certainly infected the way our journalism is viewed, even if you and I think that we need to stay true to the values that we grew up in.
Yeah. No, I fully agree with you. And I know we've had these debates, the ones you describe. I accept that we're dinosaurs, but I think one of the dinosaurial positions that I think is correct is that readers can and should be trusted to understand why certain things are published, how they're published, that there is a value to learning what the other side thinks. I don't know, maybe that has diminished somewhat. I don't see any questions coming in, so we're approaching the end. If somebody does have a question, please come in now. But otherwise, I wanted to get back to what you said originally. Your description of following the debate was very much what most people felt, the people I've spoken to since. And it made me sort of wonder, what is it I was looking for? I frankly didn't expect anything else from Trump. I suppose I might have hoped for a little more real debate on issues, but I didn't anticipate it. I think we saw what kind of people are up there. But it made me realize that for me personally, what this election is all about is really something very simple. It's decency. and that's a word Trump used. It's a quality I think he did represent. I just think that apart from what he stands for, and I think to call him a conservative or a liberal is totally misleading because in his case, it's all about opportunism. It's all about being in the limelight. I just don't want a president who's made more than 16,200 false or misleading claims, according to the tally in the Washington Post, who really doesn't care about people, who is proud of paying no taxes. I think we'll survive, and we have survived. People on the right, people on the left, ideas of all sorts. We can cope with all that. But the part that we really need to get rid of is this disdain for elemental political decency. So I was wondering if you have some final personal thoughts you'd also like to share.
So I was a little bit surprised by his performance because if you just look at the polls, it's pretty clear that the president can't get elected just with the base that elected him last time. He's lost he's lost support in some critical battleground states. And remember, this election's going to come down to 4 or 5 or 6 states, we suspect. He's lost support among women who actually overall voted for him over Hillary Clinton. He's lost support among non-college educated women. And so you might have thought that he would have, even for the most self-interested political reasons, geared his performance yesterday to trying to win over some of those constituencies that he's going to need on November 3rd. And, interestingly enough, the appointment of a Supreme Court nominee who Amy Barrett, who would be succeeding Justice Ginsburg, gives him that opportunity because he found a deeply conservative Catholic nominee who's the mother of 7 children, including 2 adopted kids, and lives in the Midwest. And he could have really focused on that as a way to try to bring over the voters that he needs the most. And while there was brief discussion at the beginning of the Supreme Court nomination and all that, he simply didn't seem to have his heart in fitting that into a larger explanation of what it was that he was doing. And he has never given us a clear view of what he wants to go do with the second term, other than to say it'll be more of like the first.
That's true, and I guess we'll be seeing a lot of this debate now as Judge Barrett's nomination comes up before the committees, although I think those should prove rather brief. But you're right. I mean, but isn't that who he is? He has this opportunity. There are claims he could have made. Judge Barrett is a case he could have made. Pulling troops out of the Middle East is something he could have been proud of. He could have spoken more about the economy before the pandemic hit. And yet he seems to have this innate preference to go for the throat, to go for the mud. And maybe that's where I say I'm not surprised, because he just couldn't.
He grew up in the New York tabloid, Serge, which you all remember well.
He couldn't not be himself. And that's what we're confronted with in this election. So I think our time is just about up. I think if this was all in the United States, I would say to all the people watching, vote, but I guess our audience is mostly international. So all I can say is watch carefully. This is one of those really decisive moments in American and global history that's coming up. And it should be interesting. What do you think, David?
Serge, it's a reminder that while we think of these all as domestic elections, and they are, and American citizens are the ones who vote, it affects the entire world because the United States so affects the entire world. And just as we've been concerned over the past 4 years about what the world has seen from us. We're concerned about the message this election sends. You know, the first election of Donald Trump, you could attribute to some oddities in the election. You could attribute to a middle class that was whose concerns and complaints were ignored by past presidents, Democratic and Republican, um, and that it was sort of a cry for attention and help. But if Donald Trump is reelected, you can't go out to the allies and say, well, this is an aberration. And in fact, the allies are always going to think, even if Joe Biden is elected, an America that elected Donald Trump has some fundamental changes that have gone on that could elect after Biden another Donald Trump like figure. So, what we do is going to send a message around the world, just as the democratic recession we have seen around the world, I think, has been in some ways encouraged by things that people have seen happen in the United States. So we shouldn't pretend that just because this is our election, it's just all about us.
Absolutely. And maybe that's the silver lining, that the world will see us for what we are, although the bad news may be that it's not something they want to see. So thank you, David. Thank all of you who joined us. And as David said, I really wish we were with you in Athens, where I hope the weather is as impeccable as it is here in the District of Columbia, where I am. So thank you, and have a wonderful forum over there.
Thank you.